History rarely begins with fireworks. Sometimes it begins with a squalling baby in a half-forgotten corner of the Mediterranean. Napoleon Bonaparte's story kicks off on Corsica, an island newly sold off to France, where the locals grumbled in Italian accents while French officials tried to convince everyone they belonged together. Into this uneasy marriage of cultures came a boy destined to boss around half of Europe. He wasn't born in a palace, but in a modest house with parents juggling noble titles that were more decorative than useful. Yet from the very first days, the world seemed to whisper, "Here is someone who will refuse to stay small." Of course, no one believed it then. He was just another child in a noisy household, probably more annoying than promising. But time has a funny sense of humor. It takes the child who struggles with French grammar and turns him into the man dictating terms to kings. This is where we start. A baby in Corsica, wrapped in family pride, surrounded by political squabbles, and entirely unaware that one day statues of him would be erected across Europe. For now, he is just little Napoleon, a boy whose destiny has yet to put on its boots. Corsica, in the late 18th century, was the awkward teenager of Europe, recently pawned off by Genoa to France, and still sulking about it. Imagine a small island where everyone insists they are unique, while Paris treats it like a souvenir purchase. The French proudly declared, "Corsica is ours now," to which the Corsicans replied, "Sure, but don't expect us to act French." Into this theater of identity crisis grew little Napoleon, surrounded by neighbors who carried grudges like family heirlooms. French officials strutted about in powdered wigs, trying to teach loyalty, while locals muttered in Italian dialects about betrayal and taxes. The landscape was beautiful, yes, mountains, olive trees, the scent of the sea. But beneath the postcard scenery lay constant tension, a tug of war between pride and practicality. Napoleon's parents raised him in this stew of resentment and ambition, a perfect recipe for someone who would later want to own more than just an island. For the moment, though, Corsica was less a paradise and more a training ground in suspicion, stubbornness, in the fine art of hating foreigners while still borrowing their money. A fitting birthplace for a future emperor who would master the politics of contradiction. If Corsica was the stage of cultural quarrels, then the Bonaparte family was a troupe of minor nobles clinging desperately to their titles, as if a dusty parchment could pay the rent. Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, liked to remind people that he was technically a nobleman, though his wallet disagreed loudly. His real talent was switching allegiances at just the right moment, a skill that Napoleon would later turn into an art form. Meanwhile, Letizia, the iron-willed mother, ran the household like a general, raising 8 children with more discipline than affection, because affection didn't put food on the table. The Bonapartes lived with one foot in pride and the other in debt, balancing like acrobats on the thin rope of survival. They weren't rich, but they were rich in the belief that their name mattered. And that was almost as good until creditors came knocking. For little Napoleon, this paradox was fuel, a boy raised to think like a prince, but eat like a peasant. In such an environment, ambition was less of a choice and more of a survival mechanism. The island may have mocked their pretensions, but from within those cramped walls, a future emperor was quietly absorbing the lesson that titles mean nothing without power. Pride was free, but bread was expensive, and the Bonaparte household had far more of the first than the second. Growing up in Corsica, little Napoleon quickly learned that noble titles didn't pay for shoes or supper. His father's schemes often ended in debts, and his mother stretched every coin like it was made of rubber. Meals were simple, often resembling the kind of rustic dishes that would never make it onto a French noble's menu, unless, of course, they were starving. Napoleon and his siblings slept close together, sharing blankets and complaints, while dreaming of futures where they weren't constantly negotiating with hunger. Yet in this environment of scarcity, ambition sprouted like weeds between cobblestones. For Napoleon, discomfort was less an obstacle and more a motivator. Each growling stomach was a reminder that he was destined for something greater than olive groves and unpaid bills. Corsica taught him early that survival required wit, resilience, and a talent for ignoring humiliation. Poverty might have wrapped the family like a shabby coat, But Napoleon wore it like armor, convinced that one day he would trade wooden spoons for golden scepters. Hunger, it turned out, was the best motivational speaker of his childhood. Behind every great man, there is usually a parent reminding him to eat his vegetables, or in Napoleon's case, two parents drilling contradictory lessons into his head. Carlo Bonaparte, the father, fancied himself a political mastermind, forever switching sides between Corsican nationalists and French administrators depending on which way the wind and the money blew. He taught young Napoleon that survival was about flexibility, or as some would call it, opportunism with a powdered wig. Letizia, on the other hand, was made of sterner stuff. With a gaze that could silence 8 children at once, she ruled the household with iron discipline and an apron. Her lesson was simple. Life doesn't owe you anything, so fight tooth and nail for every scrap. Between Carlo's smooth-talking gambles and Letizia's no-nonsense toughness, Napoleon absorbed a peculiar mix, cunning without conscience, discipline without mercy. The result was a boy who learned early that loyalty was negotiable, but ambition was not. While his father dreamed of influence, and his mother cracked down on chaos at home, Napoleon sharpened the skills that would one day let him balance empires on his shoulders. Childhood in the Bonaparte household wasn't cozy. It was a crash course in politics and survival disguised as family life. By the time most children were still arguing over toys, young Napoleon had already mastered the art of arguing over everything. He was small, sharp-eyed, and stubborn to the bone, Corsica's answer to a pocket-sized thunderstorm. While his siblings bickered or obeyed, Napoleon insisted on being in command, often promoting himself to general of their games and sentencing anyone who disobeyed to imaginary exile. Discipline wasn't just a rule in the Bonaparte household, it was Letizia's religion, and Napoleon turned out to be her most devout follower. He carried himself with a seriousness that seemed absurd on a boy who barely reached the table, correcting others as if he were already grading history itself. Teachers found him brilliant but unbearable. Classmates found him unbearable without the brilliance. He was the sort of child who could memorize a lesson, then use it to humiliate you for forgetting it. Corsica, with its rough edges and family tensions, didn't soften him. It forged him. Every denied treat became practice for self-control. Every scolding became fuel for defiance. Napoleon wasn't yet conquering nations, but he was already conquering dinner tables, playgrounds, and anyone foolish enough to think he would settle for second place. Eventually, the island became too small for Napoleon's ambition and too poor for his parents' purse. Carlo Bonaparte, ever the opportunist, secured a royal scholarship for his son in France, a golden ticket that promised education and perhaps fewer unpaid bills. The decision was both practical and symbolic. Corsica could no longer contain the boy who barked orders at siblings as if they were battalions. Packing him off to the mainland felt less like sending a child to school and more like exporting a problem. Napoleon, of course, saw it differently. To him, this was exile disguised as opportunity, a chance to prove that the son of a second-rate noble family from a backwater island could rub shoulders and eventually trample sons of France's elite. Letizia, the formidable mother, supposedly told him to return with honor or not at all, which was either heartfelt advice or the 18th century equivalent of motivational abuse. As he left, the rocky hills of Corsica receded behind him, but so did the safety of being just another stubborn island boy. Ahead lay France, foreign, hostile, and full of polished aristocrats who would sneer at his accent. Napoleon was about to learn that the road to power started with the humiliation of boarding school. When Napoleon arrived in France, he discovered that nothing humbles a future emperor faster than grammar lessons. His Corsican accent made him sound like a provincial farmer trying to order wine in a Parisian salon, and his classmates wasted no time in laughing. The boy who once commanded siblings like soldiers now found himself the butt of aristocratic jokes. They mocked his Italian-sounding French, his shabby clothes, even the way he walked. Napoleon responded with silence, storing every insult like ammunition for some future battlefield. At meals, while others chatted effortlessly, he ate quickly, staring into his soup as though plotting revenge. The teachers admired his discipline, but couldn't ignore his simmering fury. He wasn't just a foreigner. he was a Corsican foreigner, which in their eyes was worse. Yet humiliation became his training ground. Every sneer was a drill in patience, every taunt a rehearsal for command. The small boy from the island was learning the paradox of power. Before you can conquer Europe, you first have to survive being the weird kid in boarding school. And Napoleon, rather than breaking, quietly sharpened his will, turning mockery into the steel edge of ambition. Being mocked as the strange islander could have crushed a weaker boy, but for Napoleon it was the perfect fertilizer for ambition. Every insult about his accent, every sneer at his shabby Corsican origins, became fuel for a private fire that burned hotter than the school's fireplaces. He wasn't just going to prove them wrong, he was going to make them kneel. The small boy who once played general in Corsican fields now started rehearsing his role for real, vowing that one day France itself would have to respect the little outsider. He studied obsessively, buried himself in history and strategy, and clung to the belief that power was the only true language anyone understood. To the French elite, he remained the funny-sounding foreigner. To himself, he was a conqueror in training. The paradox was delicious. The more they humiliated him, the more he believed he was destined for greatness. Corsica might have been an island, but Napoleon refused to be one. He wanted the entire continent. That hunger to escape smallness, to rise above the sneers of classmates and the limits of birth, would carry him further than anyone could imagine. Destiny, it seemed, was born not from applause but from mockery. Every great tale begins with a question, and Napoleon's childhood left us with a particularly sharp one. How does a boy mocked for his accent, dismissed for his shabby clothes, and born on a rocky island nobody wanted end up reshaping Europe? At this point in his life, Napoleon was not yet a conqueror, not yet a general, not even a proper Frenchman in the eyes of his classmates. He was simply a stubborn Corsican boy with a burning need to prove that destiny didn't belong only to the well-dressed aristocrats. His hunger wasn't just for food anymore. It was for recognition, for respect, for power. The laughter of peers turned into a challenge. The struggles of poverty became a training ground. And the strict household of Carlo and Letizia became his first academy of survival. The irony is almost theatrical. Europe's future emperor forged not in glory, but in humiliation. The island gave him roots, France gave him obstacles, and together they created a boy who refused to stay small. The story now asks us the same question his life shouted at history. Can a child dismissed as insignificant rise to change the fate of an entire continent? If Napoleon thought French boarding school was harsh, Brienne Military Academy was a whole new circus. Here, boys didn't just laugh at his accent. They now competed with him in the art of humiliation. Aristocratic cadets strutted about like miniature dukes, while Napoleon, still the outsider from Corsica, shuffled in with a stubborn glare and a second-hand uniform that barely fit. But Brienne was also where he discovered the magic formula. Brains could outgun birth. While others wasted hours bragging about their noble bloodlines, Napoleon buried himself in books, plotting trajectories in mathematics like a general plotting artillery fire. His classmates mocked him for studying too much, unaware they were supplying him with yet another grudge to be repaid in the future currency of cannonballs. The academy didn't soften his edges. It sharpened them. Napoleon learned that the battlefield wasn't just a place of muskets and cannons. It started right there in the classroom, where insults flew like bullets. Every sneer, every shove in the hallway was a rehearsal for future wars. Corsica had taught him stubbornness. France had given him humiliation, and Brienne added discipline to the mix. Together, these would prove to be a very dangerous cocktail for Europe. At Brienne, Napoleon quickly discovered his true superpower: mathematics. While other cadets practiced fencing or wasted hours polishing their boots to a noble shine, he was calculating trajectories, sketching angles, and treating geometry problems like battle plans. To him, a blackboard was just an artillery map in disguise. His classmates thought he was ridiculous. Who else could look at a triangle and imagine a cannonball flying through it? But this obsession with numbers gave him an edge. He didn't just study, he strategized. He learned how to predict the arc of destruction with chalk before ever touching a cannon. Teachers, initially skeptical of the scrawny islander, grudgingly admitted that his brain could launch shells straighter than most arms. Of course, brilliance came at a social cost. While others went to parties or flirted with noble girls, Napoleon's dates were with compasses and rulers. He wasn't popular, but he was precise, and in war, precision beats popularity every time. In a world obsessed with lineage, he was proving that raw intellect could outgun aristocratic swagger. Napoleon's future empire wasn't being built with swords yet, but with numbers and the stubborn belief that math could conquer destiny. Graduating from Brienne was only the beginning. Paris Military Academy was the real crucible. Here, Napoleon was tossed into a cauldron of privilege, discipline, and powdered wigs. Surrounded by the sons of aristocrats who treated the academy as a finishing school for their dueling skills and ballroom etiquette, the Corsican outsider doubled down on his obsession with artillery. While others were perfecting their bows to ladies, Napoleon was perfecting the math of blowing holes in walls. His instructors noticed the imbalance. Socially, he was a dud, but strategically, he was dynamite. He rose through lessons like cannon fire tearing through silk curtains, impossible to ignore. By the time he graduated in 1785, barely 16, he was not the polished gentleman his classmates pretended to be, but a wiry, sharp-eyed cadet ready to swap equations for real gunpowder. Paris hadn't transformed him into a nobleman. It had forged him into something far more dangerous, a soldier who believed that intellect could beat bloodlines. The academy may have sent off dozens of officers that year, but only one would end up dictating the fate of Europe. Spoiler, it wasn't the tall, handsome ones with perfect French accents. In 1785, Napoleon graduated from Paris Military Academy and was promptly handed his first real title, Second Lieutenant of Artillery. It sounded grand, but in reality, it was less future conqueror and more junior accountant with gunpowder. The uniform was stiff, the pay was miserable, and the prestige hovered somewhere between useful servant and expendable cannon caddy. Yet Napoleon wore the rank like it was already a crown. He threw himself into drills, obsessing over cannons as if they were old friends, calculating angles and barking orders to men twice his age. Some laughed at the tiny Corsican officer who barely filled his boots, but Napoleon didn't care. Every salute he received, no matter how half-hearted, was practice for the obedience he expected one day from kings. France, meanwhile, treated him like an underpaid intern, but he was already rewriting the job description. To Napoleon, being a second lieutenant wasn't a humble beginning. It was the first rung of a ladder that reached absurdly high. While his peers saw a modest assignment, he saw destiny loading itself with gunpowder. And as history would prove, nothing travels faster than ambition riding on a cannonball. France, in the late 1780s, was a powder keg disguised as a monarchy. Bread prices skyrocketed, nobles danced while peasants starved, and every tavern was buzzing louder than any battlefield. Into this chaos walked young Lieutenant Bonaparte, eyes sharp as bayonets, silently judging a nation that seemed determined to set itself on fire. He wandered Parisian streets, observing ragged beggars and silk-clad aristocrats, both equally convinced they were victims. To Napoleon, it was like watching a tragic comedy, the ruling class pretending everything was fine while the people sharpened pitchforks off stage. He took mental notes, calculating that cannons might soon be more useful in the city squares than on foreign borders. What others saw as unrest, he saw as opportunity wrapped in smoke and slogans. France was crumbling, but Napoleon was already imagining how a clever soldier might rise from the rubble. For now, he was just a low-ranking officer staring at riots from the sidelines. But behind that stoic expression, the gears of ambition turned relentlessly. The revolution was coming, and Bonaparte didn't just plan to survive it, he intended to ride it like a cannonball straight to the top. For all his sharp wit and grand ambition, young Bonaparte's first years as an officer were anything but glorious. Instead of champagne toasts, there was stale bread. Instead of duels of honor, endless nights of shivering in drafty barracks. His pay was pitiful, barely enough to buy ink and candles. Yet he spent both furiously scribbling notes and ideas while others drank away their sorrows. Loneliness clung to him like a second uniform. Corsican by blood, French by career, yet never fully belonging to either world. His fellow officers mocked his accent, The nobility sniffed at his modest background, and the streets outside echoed with riots he could do nothing about. It was a comedy of misery, a future emperor at that moment reduced to counting pennies and patching boots. Yet beneath the hunger and isolation, his ambition only grew sharper. Each insult became fuel, every night of hunger a rehearsal for resilience. History would later paint him as a titan, but in these lean years, Bonaparte looked more like a half-starved chess player, waiting patiently for the board to clear before making his move. After nights of gnawing hunger and counting coins, Bonaparte found a new outlet for his restless ambition: the pen. If the battlefield would not yet grant him glory, then pamphlets and political essays would have to do. He poured his frustrations into paper, railing against the corruption of France while stubbornly defending Corsica's dignity. His words were sharp, sarcastic, and occasionally too honest for his own good. Half philosophy, half street brawl. Fellow officers dismissed his writings as the ramblings of a provincial hothead, while intellectuals smirked at the young artillery officer who thought he could play Rousseau with gunpowder stains on his cuffs. Yet his texts began to circulate, gaining whispers of admiration and plenty of scorn. The irony was delicious. The man who could barely afford ink was producing manifestos thick enough to choke a censor. His loyalty seemed torn, Corsican by blood, French by uniform, but his pen betrayed his obsession with power, justice, and a stage larger than the island of his birth. What began as scribbles in candlelight was the first taste of the theater of politics, where words could be as dangerous as cannon fire, and every essay was a rehearsal for the empire he hadn't yet admitted he wanted. Family for Napoleon was supposed to be the anchor of his restless ambition, but instead it became a storm. Corsica, his proud island homeland, had split in two. Some clung fiercely to independence, waving their tiny flag like a defiant child against France, while others bent eagerly toward Paris, dreaming of titles and French salaries. The Bonapartes were caught in this tug of war, and dinners quickly turned into political battlegrounds. Imagine Napoleon, in uniform, arguing with a brother still loyal to Corsican rebels, forks rattling, voices rising, and mother trying to keep the bread from becoming a projectile. For a young officer who had just started writing manifestos, this domestic chaos was worse than any artillery barrage. His loyalty was questioned from both sides. The Corsicans saw him as a traitor in French blue, while French officers still eyed him as a provincial outsider. The irony was sharp. Napoleon could calculate a cannon's trajectory with flawless precision, but he could not predict which side of his own family would slam the door on him next. This was not merely a family dispute, it was a rehearsal for the lifelong tension between roots and empire, identity and ambition, love and betrayal. After the chaos of family disputes and Corsican quarrels, Napoleon finally made his choice. He strapped on the French uniform and refused to take it off. It was less about patriotism and more about survival. France had cannons, Corsica had goats. In the pragmatic math of a future emperor, artillery always outweighed livestock. Yet the decision was not without bitterness. To Corsican nationalists, he was now a sellout, a man who had traded his island soul for French buttons and epaulets. To the French elite, he remained an ambitious provincial with a heavy accent, tolerated but not embraced. And still, Napoleon gritted his teeth and marched forward. There was something darkly comic about it. Here was a young officer, barely able to afford his boots, already trying to calculate the balance of power between republics, monarchies, and revolutions. Loyalty for him became less about birthplace and more about opportunity. A professional gambler choosing the table most likely to pay out. His decision to stand with France was not the end of his identity crisis, but the beginning of a lifelong duel between the islander who longed for belonging and the general who hungered for an empire. By the time the dust settled on his youthful struggles, Napoleon had stitched together the beginnings of a destiny that was far larger than the threadbare coat he wore. From Brienne's school benches to the echoing halls of Paris, from a hungry officer scribbling radical essays to a soldier torn between Corsican roots and French cannons, every detour had pushed him closer to the inevitable. His career was still a shaky ladder of minor promotions and borrowed boots, but the outline of a future giant was faintly visible. Ironically, no one around him saw it. To his fellow officers, he was just the short guy with the sharp tongue and the obsessive love for artillery. Yet in the dark comedy of fate, that was exactly the setup. The awkward outsider destined to upstage kings and emperors. The young lieutenant who couldn't afford dinner would one day feast on Europe itself. As this chapter of his life closes, Napoleon's path is not yet paved with glory, but with mud, debt, and ridicule. And still, somewhere beneath the shabby uniform, there flickers the reckless certainty of a man who already suspects the world will soon be his table, and he intends to dine alone. France, 1789, a year when bread cost more than dignity and guillotines were about to become the most popular form of street entertainment. The revolution erupted not with polite debates, but with mobs storming the Bastille like it was the grand opening of a discount store. Aristocrats, who once paraded in powdered wigs, suddenly discovered their necks weren't as secure as they thought. Paris smelled of smoke, sweat, and political pamphlets printed faster than gossip. In the chaos, young Napoleon watched history unfold with the morbid curiosity of someone who sensed opportunity hiding beneath the rubble. He wasn't yet the general who would redraw Europe, but already the outsider calculating his move in a game where kings were toppled like chess pawns. The streets were alive with chants of liberty and the metallic rhythm of forged pikes. To most, the revolution was terror and hunger. To Napoleon, it was an open audition, and he was quietly preparing his role. France was a theater on fire, and Bonaparte, armed with ambition, sharper than any guillotine blade, was waiting in the wings for his cue. Amid the storm of revolution, Napoleon quickly found himself gravitating toward the Jacobins, the radical faction that promised liberty, equality, and a healthy dose of guillotines for dessert. For a young officer with ambition sharper than his saber, siding with the Jacobins was both a political statement and a career insurance plan. They were loud, uncompromising, and terrifyingly fashionable in their rhetoric. Napoleon admired their energy, though perhaps less their tendency to turn every disagreement into a public execution. He wasn't shouting "Liberté" in the streets just for the poetry. He calculated that aligning with the radical tide would lift him higher than quietly clinging to neutrality. Corsican roots still tugged at his heart, but France's revolution was a grander stage, and Napoleon wasn't about to miss his cue. As aristocrats lost their heads, literally, the artillery lieutenant positioned himself as a devoted supporter of the new order, carefully balancing conviction with ambition. His pen joined his sword. He wrote pamphlets that flattered Jacobin ideals while keeping his own image polished. If the revolution was a banquet of chaos, Napoleon had just found the right table, and he was determined to sit at the head of it sooner or later. The siege of Toulon in 1793 was less a battle and more a theater of incompetence, until a young artillery officer named Napoleon decided to rewrite the script. The French Republic was trying, and failing spectacularly, to retake the port city from royalists backed by the British. Generals argued, soldiers starved, and cannons sat unused like stage props in a forgotten play. Enter Napoleon, short on stature but overflowing with audacity. He looked at the chaos, rolled his eyes, and declared that if the generals couldn't aim, he certainly could. With a map, some quick calculations, and an ego that could fill the entire harbor, he repositioned the artillery with surgical precision. The effect was devastating. French cannons suddenly roared with deadly accuracy, turning British ships into floating bonfires. Soldiers who had been ready to mutiny now followed the Corsican lieutenant as if he were a messiah with gunpowder. The Republic, once embarrassed, now looked triumphant. For Napoleon, Toulon wasn't just a victory, it was his personal debut, his moment of stepping into the spotlight. While others saw a battle, he saw an audition, and by the end he had earned not just applause, but a promotion, with destiny starting to whisper his name. When Toulon finally fell, the French Republic cheered as if the revolution had just won its first Oscar. But the real star of the show wasn't the politicians in Paris. It was the short Corsican artillery officer who had turned chaos into fireworks. Napoleon's victory catapulted him from anonymity to instant celebrity, like a band's drummer suddenly becoming the lead singer. Within weeks, he was promoted to brigadier general, a meteoric rise that left older officers grinding their teeth and muttering, "Who let this kid skip the line?" But merit, and a knack for making cannons talk, was hard to argue with. Napoleon had proven that war wasn't about endless debates in smoky rooms, but about where you aimed your guns. Paris hailed him as a prodigy. The Jacobins praised him as a loyal servant of the revolution, and his enemies learned that underestimating him was a career-ending mistake. Toulon wasn't just a battle, it was the launch pad. For Napoleon, it was less mission accomplished and more season premiere. The revolution had found its golden boy, and France had just discovered that sometimes destiny comes in the form of a 24-year-old with gunpowder on his boots and ambition in his eyes. At just 24, Napoleon found himself wearing the stars of a general, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The army was full of men twice his age, with twice the wrinkles, who had spent decades polishing boots only to watch this Corsican upstart leapfrog straight to command. Napoleon, however, didn't bother with modesty. He carried himself like a man born with epaulets sewn onto his baby clothes. His style was bold, bordering on reckless, the kind of daring that made subordinates cheer and superiors grind their molars. Where others saw risks, Napoleon saw opportunities, preferably the kind that involved cannons rearranging enemy formations. He wasn't just a general, he was theater in uniform, a spectacle on horseback. His troops adored him because he didn't waste lives needlessly, but he demanded discipline with the sharpness of a bayonet. Paris gossiped about him endlessly. Was he a genius or just a lucky Corsican gambler? The truth didn't matter yet. What mattered was that France suddenly had a new poster boy for ambition. A youthful general who treated war like a game of high-stakes poker. Except the chips were thousands of soldiers, and the deck was loaded with gunpowder. In Paris, Napoleon was no longer just a fiery young general with a knack for artillery. He was also becoming something of a political tightrope walker. To survive, he had to master the art of nodding in agreement without actually promising anything. He mingled with Jacobins, exchanged pleasantries with moderates, and even sipped watered wine with ambitious schemers. Everyone wanted to claim him as their protege, but Napoleon played the game like a seasoned gambler, keeping his cards close while flashing just enough charm to keep them guessing. His Corsican accent, once mocked, now sounded exotic at Parisian salons, where revolutionaries debated philosophy over stale bread. He listened, smiled thinly, and let others do the shouting while he quietly measured who might be useful tomorrow. For Napoleon, politics wasn't about loyalty, it was about survival and leverage. Every handshake was a possible cannonball, every toast a test of allegiance. He was learning that in revolutionary France, power didn't just come from the barrel of a gun, it also came from being in the right room with the right conspirators, preferably without being guillotined afterward. When the Jacobins fell from grace, Paris became a dangerous playground where yesterday's allies were today's liabilities. Guillotines clattered like background music, and Napoleon suddenly found himself on the wrong guest list. His Jacobin friendships, once political assets, now looked like tickets to the executioner's express. But the young general had a talent for survival. He knew when to salute, when to disappear, and when to feign loyalty with the enthusiasm of a man pretending to enjoy bad wine. He kept his head low, literally, since keeping it high might have attracted the blade, and stayed just useful enough to avoid suspicion. Rumors spread that he was finished, a relic of radical excess. Yet Napoleon was like a cork in a stormy sea. No matter how hard the waves tried to drown him, he popped back up, dripping but afloat. His secret weapon wasn't just military genius, but the uncanny ability to reinvent himself faster than politicians could trade insults. The guillotine missed him, but only just, and Paris learned that Napoleon was too sharp, too fast, and perhaps too lucky to be chopped into history's leftovers. Paris, once roaring with revolutionary chants, now echoed with angry mobs demanding bread, justice, or sometimes just something to smash. By 1795, the streets boiled with unrest, and the government trembled like a drunk acrobat. Enter Napoleon, still young, ambitious, and with cannons itching for attention. When the mob stormed the capital, he was given a simple order: stop them by any means necessary. Napoleon, never one for subtlety, rolled out artillery as if he were staging a fireworks show. Instead of sparklers, though, Paris got grape shot. The streets thundered, smoke rose, and the mob learned that musket balls travel faster than revolutionary slogans. In one brutal afternoon, Napoleon transformed from a sidelined officer into the government's favorite problem solver. Cynics whispered that he had killed fellow citizens. Admirers praised him as the man who saved France from chaos. Napoleon, meanwhile, just dusted off his uniform and smirked. He had proven that with enough cannons, even political instability could be silenced, at least until the next riot. It was ruthless, effective, and undeniably theatrical, the kind of performance Paris would never forget. The smoke of grape shot hadn't even cleared when Paris began rewriting the script. Yesterday's obscure artillery officer was now painted as the savior of the revolution. Politicians who had barely remembered Napoleon's name suddenly tripped over themselves to praise him, as if they had always believed in his genius. Newspapers described him as a guardian angel, though a rather loud one with cannons instead of wings. To the government, he wasn't just a soldier. He was a miracle cure for instability. Citizens whispered about the ruthless young man who stopped chaos with a single order to fire, torn between fear and admiration. Some saw him as a butcher, others as a hero, but everyone agreed on one thing. France had found its new enforcer. Napoleon, meanwhile, played the role with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to brag. The echoes of cannon fire still did the talking. In a city addicted to drama, he had delivered the perfect performance. Blood-soaked, shocking, and unforgettable. And now, with Paris under control, the stage was his for the taking. By the time the smoke settled, France had a brand new star, and it wasn't a politician with endless speeches, but a young general with a taste for cannon fire. Napoleon's rise was so fast it made heads spin, from an obscure Corsican officer to the man newspapers dubbed the Lion of the Republic. The irony, just a few years earlier, nobody wanted to pronounce his name correctly. Now every salon and tavern echoed with it. To some, he was the savior who crushed chaos under iron discipline. To others, he was a dangerous gambler who played dice with the fate of Paris. But whether adored or feared, the result was the same. Napoleon had arrived. His boldness, his uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right bloody moment, had turned him into the Republic's golden boy. In a revolution that had already devoured many of its own, this one survivor not only avoided the guillotine, he climbed over it to reach power. And so the once anonymous artillery officer stood on the stage of history, ready for the next act, while the audience of Europe leaned forward, half in awe, half in dread. In 1796, France handed Napoleon a poisoned chalice, or so everyone thought. He was given command of the Army of Italy, a ragtag collection of half-starved men with boots more holes than leather, and morale so low they might as well have been digging their own graves. The politicians in Paris probably imagined this was a safe way to bury their ambitious young general under a pile of logistical nightmares. But Napoleon, instead of panicking, saw opportunity. Italy wasn't just a backwater theater, it was the stage he could dominate. He arrived like a man crashing a dinner party, young, audacious, and absolutely unwilling to follow the script. At just 26, barely older than some of his lieutenants, he had the audacity to act like destiny was already on his payroll. While the soldiers grumbled, Napoleon sharpened his speeches and his gaze, ready to whip the army into something resembling a weapon. This wasn't going to be a quiet tour of duty. It was going to be a cannon-blasting announcement that France had a new warlord in town. The so-called side assignment would become the opening act of his legend. And Italy, poor Italy, was about to become both his playground and his billboard. Napoleon knew that half-starved men don't march for rations, they march for glory, or at least for someone convincing enough to make them believe glory tastes better than bread. Standing before his ragged army, he unleashed words like cannon fire. He promised them riches looted from Italy, triumphs that would make them the envy of Paris, and, most importantly, a chance to stop being the butt of every soldier's joke. His speeches were less about strategy and more about stand-up comedy with a bayonet twist, mocking the enemy, exaggerating their weakness, then flipping the punchline into a rallying cry. The soldiers who just minutes ago looked ready to desert now shouted like rock fans at a concert. Napoleon had turned desperation into adrenaline, weaving a story where each man was no longer a pawn in France's political mess, but a hero in waiting. He didn't just give them orders, he gave them a script where they starred in the great drama of history. And in that moment, the army of Italy stopped being a collection of beggars with muskets and became something far more dangerous. An army that believed in Napoleon as much as Napoleon believed in himself. The campaign in Italy did not begin with a grand opera, but with Montenotte, a battle so lopsided it felt like Napoleon was playing chess while his Austrian opponents were still trying to find the checkers board. With fewer men, worse supplies, and soldiers who still smelled of last night's soup, Napoleon decided not to wait for the enemy's move. He lunged first, striking with speed that left the Austrians blinking like confused owls. His soldiers, newly pumped with the memory of his fiery speeches, charged as if their bayonets were forks at a free buffet. The Austrians, meanwhile, collapsed faster than a bad joke at a funeral, retreating in disarray. Napoleon had shown them that audacity was not just a personality trait, but a weapon. Montenotte wasn't merely a victory. It was a declaration that this short Corsican with oversized ambitions had arrived. From this point on, Italy wasn't just a theater of war. It was Napoleon's stage, and Montenotte was his opening act. The curtain had risen, and Europe would not be able to look away, whether it liked the performance or not. Montenotte was just the appetizer. What followed was a buffet of victories that left Austria and its allies clutching their stomachs in disbelief. In battle after battle, Millesimo, Dago, Lodi, Napoleon served defeat like it was his favorite dish. The Austrians, who once boasted of their discipline, now looked like a marching band that lost both the music sheet and the conductor. Napoleon, meanwhile, darted across Italy with the energy of a man who had overdosed on ambition and caffeine. His troops, hungry and shoeless, somehow marched faster and fought harder, as if sheer audacity was a food group. Every time the Austrians regrouped, Napoleon popped up again, like a particularly annoying jack-in-the-box with cannons. The coalition forces didn't just lose ground, they lost morale, dignity, and probably their sense of humor. Italy became a playground where Napoleon rewrote the rules of war, making the old generals look like dusty antiques in a modern showroom. Victory was no longer a question of if, but of how quickly Napoleon could humiliate yet another enemy before moving on to the next. By now, Napoleon wasn't just winning, he was reinventing the entire choreography of war. Old generals moved armies like they were dragging furniture across a parlor. Napoleon moved his like a street magician, shuffling cards, leaving his enemies guessing where the ace would pop up next. His genius wasn't in brute strength, but in speed, surprise, and a flair for the dramatic. War as theater, with the Austrians perpetually cast as the clueless, supporting actors. He split his forces, then stitched them back together at the perfect moment, hitting the enemy where they least expected it. Soldiers marched in impossible directions, through mountains and mud, as if gravity and exhaustion had simply stopped applying to them. The French army was lean, hungry, and oddly fashionable in their tattered uniforms, while the Austrians lumbered about like overdressed aristocrats on a hunting trip. Each maneuver was a punchline, and the joke was always on the coalition. By the time they realized Napoleon was behind them, beside them, and in front of them all at once, the curtain had already fallen. Strategy had turned into satire, and Napoleon was the comedian with cannons. After turning the Austrian armies into a running gag, Napoleon now picked up a quill instead of a saber. The Campo Formio Treaty of 1797 wasn't just ink on parchment. It was Napoleon's way of rearranging the European chessboard, like a kid flipping the board game when he's winning. Austria lost big chunks of territory, France gained shiny new real estate, and Venice, once a proud republic, was tossed around like a bargaining chip at a poker table. Diplomats from Vienna sat there with faces so long they could sweep the marble floor, while Napoleon smirked like a dealer raking in chips. The real punchline? This peace wasn't peace at all. It was a contract written in disappearing ink, one that guaranteed future wars, only with better dramatic entrances. Still, back in Paris, Napoleon was hailed as not just a conqueror, but now a negotiator. The man who could dictate terms with a sword in one hand and a pen in the other. Campo Formio wasn't the end of the Italian campaign. It was the intermission before Act Two of Europe's long tragicomedy. By the time the ink of Campo Formio had dried, Napoleon was already rehearsing his next role, national hero. He didn't just win battles, he curated them like an artist arranging a gallery. Painters rushed to immortalize him on horseback, looking 10 feet taller than he actually was. Pamphlets described him as the savior of France, conveniently leaving out the bits where entire villages were flattened. Soldiers adored him, politicians tolerated him, and the public treated him like the celebrity who could do no wrong, until he did. Napoleon understood that image was as lethal as artillery, so he staged his triumphs, grand parades with him front and center, medals gleaming, hat tilted at the perfect angle, all while pretending to be modest. The irony? His legend was less about gunpowder and more about good PR. The boy from Corsica had cracked the ultimate code. In a world tired of kings and priests, people wanted a new myth to believe in, and Napoleon, with his smirk and his saber, was more than happy to audition for the part. In Italy, Napoleon was a paradox wrapped in a bicorn hat. To some, he was the liberator, marching in with promises of freedom, equality, and cheaper bread. To others, he was just another conqueror with better hair and a louder fanfare. Italian towns greeted him with flowers and cheers, right before handing over taxes and supplies that could feed an army twice his size. Priests blessed him in public, but whispered curses in private, while merchants painted his portrait to sell, cashing in on the latest Corsican craze. Ordinary citizens stood in awe at his victories, but they also locked their doors tighter at night, unsure if the man hailed as a hero might turn out to be just another foreign overlord. Napoleon, of course, played both roles flawlessly. Benevolent savior during the day, ruthless tax collector by night. And so, the Italians admired him the way you admire a lightning storm. Beautiful, powerful, and best enjoyed from a safe distance. By the end of his Italian campaign, Napoleon was no longer just a general with a sharp uniform and an oversized hat. He was a political phenomenon. Victories on the battlefield had transformed into victories in the salons, the newspapers, and even in the backroom deals of Paris. The once obscure Corsican artilleryman now dictated terms to kings and cardinals, and his words carried more weight than the muskets of his soldiers. He had mastered the art of publicity. Every cannon blast became a headline, every treaty a performance. France didn't just see him as a commander, they began whispering about him as a leader, maybe even a savior. Of course, the irony was thick. Napoleon had set out to win battles but ended up winning votes of confidence, unintentionally auditioning for a bigger stage. The man who once promised his army only glory and bread was now tasting the appetizer course of political power. And like any ambitious diner, he clearly wasn't planning to stop at just one dish. Italy was not just a battlefield, it was a launch pad, and Napoleon had strapped himself to it like a rocket with no off switch. After Montenotti, after Campo Formio, after 1,000 headlines proclaiming him France's golden boy, the truth was clear. Italy had transformed him from a young general with ambition into a myth in progress. The irony? He came to Italy as a hired hand of the Republic, but left it as a one-man brand, the kind of figure who could sell glory like it was cheap wine. Soldiers adored him, politicians feared him, and common folk whispered his name as if saying it too loudly might summon cannons in their backyard. What was supposed to be a regional campaign now looked suspiciously like a rehearsal for world domination. Italy had given him more than victories. It had given him a stage, a spotlight, and an audience hungry for the next act. And Napoleon, ever the showman, wasn't about to exit. It was only intermission, and the empire-sized curtain was just beginning to rise. Fresh off his Italian victories, Napoleon looked at Europe and thought, too small. His eyes turned east toward Egypt, the so-called gateway to the Orient, or as he liked to call it, France's exotic new sandbox. In his mind, conquering Egypt wasn't just about glory, it was about choking Britain's trade routes and rewriting the geography books with his name scribbled all over them. France's politicians were happy to wave him off. Better to have the over-ambitious general sunburning himself by the Nile than overshadowing them in Paris. Napoleon, ever the salesman, wrapped the campaign in grand rhetoric, civilizing missions, bringing science, and of course, a little empire building on the side. The soldiers? They weren't sure if they were liberators, invaders, or unpaid tourists. But the young general's charisma was intoxicating. And soon an army that once marched through vineyards was trudging toward pyramids. It was madness disguised as strategy, adventure dressed up as destiny. And with a grin that said he was auditioning for Alexander the Great's comeback tour, Napoleon set his course for Egypt, the desert waiting like a stage that promised either eternal glory or a very sandy disaster. July 1798. The desert sun turned the battlefield into a frying pan, and Napoleon, never one to miss theatrical timing, pointed toward the looming pyramids and declared, "Soldiers, 40 centuries are watching you," as if the Sphinx itself had bought a ticket to his performance. The French army, arranged in massive square formations, faced the Mamluk cavalry charging like a sandstorm of scimitars and silk. It looked suicidal. Elegant horses, glittering sabers, a storm of dust and chaos. But then the French squares held, bayonets bristling like hedgehogs in perfect rhythm. The Mamluks crashed, the French fired, and history was rewritten in gunpowder smoke. What could have been a massacre turned into a massacre of the other kind. Napoleon, standing coolly in the center, looked less like a general and more like a director staging his most dramatic scene yet. Pyramids as the backdrop, muskets as the soundtrack, corpses as props. By sunset, the desert was littered with broken cavalry and French soldiers cheering. The so-called Battle of the Pyramids wasn't just a victory, it was Napoleon's personal audition for the role of Pharaoh. And judging by the terrified awe of his enemies, the desert critics gave him 5 stars. Fresh from the triumph at the pyramids, Napoleon thought he was rewriting destiny itself. But then came the British, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, who clearly hadn't read Napoleon's script. At the Battle of the Nile in August 1798, the French fleet sat lazily anchored in Aboukir Bay, as if waiting for room service. Nelson, ever the party crasher, pounced at dusk, threading his ships between the French line and the shore. Suddenly, French vessels found themselves trapped like ducks in a shooting gallery. Cannon fire ripped through masts, sailors scrambled like panicked ants, and explosions painted the night sky with fiery chaos. The crown jewel, the flagship L'Orient, caught fire and erupted in a blast so massive that both sides stopped fighting just to gasp at the spectacle. By dawn, the French Navy was shattered, stranded in Egypt with no lifeline home. Napoleon, who had just promised his men glory eternal, now stood in the desert with nothing but sand, silence, and the faint echo of Nelson's laughter across the sea. It was proof that while Napoleon could dominate on land, the ocean had a different director, and his name was Nelson. After the Nile turned his fleet into charcoal, Napoleon discovered a new weapon that didn't explode: curiosity. If you can't sail home, publish. So he rolled out the scholars he'd packed like secret artillery: astronomers, chemists, draftsmen, linguists, an entire traveling university in moth-eaten coats. Under a sun that could roast a camel, they measured pyramids with tape and pride, pointed brass instruments at stars that refused to blink, and argued about Latin while their ink boiled. Napoleon founded an institute in Cairo, held meetings by candlelight, and nodded gravely at words like taxonomy as if he'd invented them. Soldiers guarded ruins, artists sketched hieroglyphs, engineers dragged a portable printing press across the sand so propaganda could arrive fresher than bread. The locals watched this parade of frenetic curiosity with the same expression one reserves for eccentric house guests who also happen to be armed. It was conquest rebranded as field research. Less looting, more labeling. And while France's enemies owned the sea, Napoleon tried owning the narrative, turning defeat into a syllabus and disaster into a museum gift shop. Somewhere out there, a certain stone waited to upstage them all. For now, the desert became a classroom, and the chalk was made of bone-dry history. The desert classroom finally produced a star pupil. In 1799, at a dusty fort near Rosetta, a French lieutenant, Bouchard, equal parts boredom and sunburn, told his sappers to quit scraping mortar because the wall itself was winking at him. Out slid a slab of black basalt, scratched with 3 kinds of fancy handwriting: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. The same decree repeated thrice like a bureaucracy with commitment issues. The scholars swarmed it as if it were cold water in July. Rubbings were taken, letters traced, egos inflated. The portable press coughed to life and began spitting copies so fast you'd think the stone had hired a publicist. Napoleon arrived, smiled that careful, camera-ready smile, and declared the find a victory of reason. Translation: the navy is sunk, but the alphabet floats. Word raced across Europe. Not a treasure chest, but a user manual to a civilization. The joke, of course, was cosmic. The one object that could make them immortal was too heavy to steal quietly and just light enough to be stolen later. For now, the slab sat under guard, scholars posing like midwives of history. In a campaign where ships exploded and rations rotted, the most enduring conquest fit neatly inside a crate. Glory began to rot in the Egyptian sun. After the fireworks of pyramids and Rosetta Stones, the French army discovered a less glamorous foe: logistics. Bread turned to dust before it reached the camp, wine evaporated faster than promises, and mules dropped dead in the sand as if auditioning for a tragic opera. Then came the true conqueror of armies: disease. Dysentery swept through the tents, malaria hummed like an invisible orchestra, and the desert coughed up plagues more efficiently than any cannon. Soldiers who had once marched like steel automata now shuffled like extras in a zombie play. The French medics, under-equipped and overworked, invented treatments with equal parts opium and optimism. Napoleon, ever the actor, rode among his sick troops stroking his chin, insisting that suffering was temporary but glory eternal. The men, doubled over in misery, probably disagreed. Supplies dwindled, morale sagged, and the once invincible Grande Armée looked like a troop stuck in a tragic comedy of heat, hunger, and pestilence. Egypt, which had promised to be the jewel of the Orient, now looked suspiciously like a sandy graveyard for ambition. Even the pyramids seemed to smirk. Conquer us all you like, but try fighting mosquitoes. By now, Egypt had turned into a stage where glory collapsed into farce. Napoleon, realizing the desert was winning the war more efficiently than the British, decided it was time to leave. But here's the twist. He didn't pack up everyone. Instead, the great general performed his finest disappearing act, sneaking back to France while leaving thousands of soldiers stranded under the Egyptian sun. The men who had once marched with visions of empire now stared in disbelief, abandoned like unwanted props after the final act of a play. Some cursed his name, others simply lay in the sand too sick to care, while a few still clung to their uniforms as if cloth could protect them from betrayal. Napoleon justified his escape as a strategic necessity, but to the rank and file it looked suspiciously like desertion with a bicorn hat. As he boarded a ship, eyes gleaming with political ambition, he probably rehearsed his next role: savior of France. Meanwhile, the unlucky troops left behind were cast in the tragic comedy of surviving starvation, disease, and British harassment, proof that even legends sometimes exit stage left without their supporting cast. History loves irony, and Napoleon's Egyptian adventure served it in abundance. Militarily, the campaign was a flaming wreck. The fleet at the Nile lay in ashes, the troops were rotting under the desert sun, and Britain laughed all the way back to London. Yet somehow in Europe, the story was retold like a glossy brochure. Pamphlets praised the victories at the pyramids, scholars bragged about discoveries, and artists painted Napoleon as a visionary, standing tall among ancient ruins. The chaos of dysentery and sandstorms was cropped out, replaced with heroic poses in pyramids bathed in golden light. It was a marketing triumph masquerading as conquest. Napoleon, ever the showman, understood that in politics, optics matter more than outcomes. Better to lose an army than lose face. So while Egypt itself remained unconquered, the myth of Napoleon as a modern Alexander the Great was successfully exported home. France got the legend without the sand in their shoes, proving once again that empires might crumble, but good PR never dies. Napoleon, the man who once posed like a pharaoh under the Egyptian sun, quietly slipped back into France in 1799 as if returning from a summer holiday gone wrong. He left behind thousands of soldiers to bake in the desert, but carried home the only souvenir that mattered: his myth. France, meanwhile, was collapsing into political chaos, with the Directory government wobbling like a drunk at closing time. When Napoleon reappeared in Paris, people didn't see a failed general covered in sand and dysentery. They saw a national savior emerging from the exotic East. The press, of course, played along, turning his Egyptian escapade into a victory parade in print. By the time he set foot in the capital, whispers of hero filled the salons and marketplaces alike. The irony, he had lost ships, men, and credibility abroad. But at home, every disaster became fuel for his political rocket. Egypt may have been a graveyard for French ambitions, but it became the launchpad for Napoleon's next act, conquering Paris itself. From the scorching sands of Egypt, Napoleon emerged not as a sunburnt failure, but as a man rehearsing for his next grand performance. Egypt had drained his army, sunk his ships, and filled the desert with bones. Yet somehow he managed to carry home only the shining illusion of triumph. In France, the government was collapsing like a sandcastle under a rising tide, and the people were desperate for a savior who looked good in uniform. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, dusted off the desert sand and polished his image until he gleamed brighter than the Rosetta Stone. The irony was delicious. While his soldiers rotted abroad, he returned home to applause, whispers of destiny, and invitations to seize the stage of power. What began as a failed Oriental fantasy was about to transform into a European drama. The boy general who once chased mirages in Egypt was now poised to grasp the most tangible prize of all, France itself. The curtain closed on Egypt, but it was only the opening act for his rise to political supremacy. France, after years of revolutionary fireworks, now looked less like the land of liberty and more like a drunken circus where the acrobats kept dropping the baton. The Directory, that five-headed monster of governance, was staggering under corruption, incompetence, and the small detail that nobody trusted them anymore. Inflation devoured coins like rats chewing through bread, armies were unpaid and grumbling, and Paris itself simmered with discontent like a pot left too long on the fire. The government responded with paperwork, decrees, and the occasional bayonet, none of which managed to impress a population tired of empty promises. Meanwhile, foreign threats pressed at the borders, making France look like a leaking boat where the captains were arguing over who got the driest chair. The once proud republic had become a parody of itself, and whispers grew louder. France didn't need 5 bickering officials, it needed one strong figure to grab the wheel. Into this vacuum of chaos and despair, destiny prepared a short Corsican with big ambitions and an even bigger hat. The Directory might still have been standing, but it was wobbling like a drunk at closing time, waiting for someone to push it over. When Napoleon returned from the Egyptian fiasco, Paris didn't see a defeated general crawling home. It saw a hero striding in with sand still stuck in his boots and a grin that screamed, "Yes, I lost, but didn't I look magnificent doing it?" The public, starved of victories and drowning in the incompetence of the Directory, welcomed him like a rock star. Crowds filled the streets, waving tricolor flags and shouting his name as if he were the new Messiah, conveniently forgetting that the British had turned his fleet into confetti at the Nile. Newspapers, ever eager to sell a good story, painted him as France's savior, glossing over the small matter that he had abandoned thousands of soldiers in Egypt like unwanted baggage. But in politics, memory is short and image is everything. To the people, Napoleon wasn't a retreating general. He was the man who had stared down pyramids, outwitted Mamluks, and returned to rescue France from its squabbling rulers. His timing was impeccable. France was desperate, the Directory was gasping, and he looked like the only one capable of kicking the whole mess into order. The legend of Napoleon was reborn, not from victory, but from theater. While the streets of Paris still echoed with cheers for their sandy-footed hero, behind closed doors the real game began. The Directory was weak, stumbling like a drunk at closing time, and Napoleon knew it. A plot began to take shape, not whispered in shadows, but discussed with the subtlety of wolves planning dinner. Politicians, generals, and opportunists gathered in smoky rooms, pretending it was about saving the Republic when everyone knew it was about saving their own skins. CAS, the mastermind with the charisma of a damp rag, dreamed of reshaping France but lacked muscle. Napoleon, on the other hand, had both muscle and the appetite for power. The alliance was awkward but convenient. One man supplied ideas, the other supplied cannons. Pamphlets were printed, loyalties bought, and soldiers quietly shuffled into position under the excuse of protecting the Republic. Everyone nodded solemnly while secretly sharpening knives. Paris became a stage, and the script was clear. The Directory would exit, Napoleon would enter, and democracy would once again be reminded that it was only a guest star in the French Revolution. The coup wasn't just being prepared, it was practically gift-wrapped with a tricolor bow. The day was November 9th, 1799, known to the revolutionary calendar as 18 Brumaire, and France's democracy was about to trip over its own shoelaces. The Directory tried to look composed, but its leaders were sweating like bakers in July. Napoleon, freshly returned from Egypt, marched into the scene with all the subtlety of a man who knew the play ended with him as the star. Soldiers filled the chambers, not with rifles raised, but with expressions that said, "Guess who's boss now?" Deputies of the Council of 500 shouted about legality, but their voices were drowned out by bayonets glinting under torchlight. Napoleon, never a great orator, stumbled through a speech about saving the Republic, sounding less like Cicero and more like a man selling umbrellas in a storm. Yet power doesn't always belong to the best talker. It belongs to the one with armed friends. Chaos erupted, deputies fled, and CAS smirked from the sidelines as the script unfolded perfectly. By the time the smoke cleared, the Republic had been shoved off stage, and Napoleon stood in the spotlight. The coup of 18 Brumaire wasn't a revolution. It was a hostile takeover with a French accent. With the Directory tossed into history's recycling bin, France needed a shiny new form of government, or at least a fresh coat of paint. Enter the consulate, a system that sounded collegial but worked more like a three-legged race where one guy carried the other two. Officially, there were 3 consuls meant to share power, but everyone knew who held the loudest megaphone: Napoleon. CAS, who had dreamed of pulling strings from behind the curtain, quickly realized he had hired a lion to guard the henhouse. The first sessions of the new regime were comical. Napoleon sitting at the center like a headmaster, flanked by 2 colleagues who nodded politely, as if auditioning for the role of furniture. The French people, exhausted by years of chaos, greeted the new arrangement with cautious relief. It looked stable, it sounded stable. And if Napoleon occasionally rewrote the script mid-meeting, who cared? France had gone from revolutionary slogans to managerial catchphrases in record time. The consulate was sold as a republic reborn, but in practice it was just a monarchy with 3 chairs and only one man sitting comfortably. Spoiler, he wasn't planning to share the seat for long. Once Napoleon had secured his seat at the top, he wasted no time rearranging France like a man who had just been handed the keys to a cluttered attic. The Directory's leftovers, confused ministers, corrupt bureaucrats, and generals with more ego than strategy, were swiftly replaced or shoved into political closets. Napoleon's approach was ruthless but oddly efficient. Fire half, terrify the rest, and promote anyone willing to salute faster than they could think. The army, meanwhile, was polished into a weapon of theater as much as war. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to chaotic leadership suddenly found themselves in a drill that looked like a mix of ballet and bayonet practice. Behind the stern discipline, there was showmanship. Napoleon knew that marching troops in perfect lines wasn't just about war, it was about optics. France needed to look powerful, and nothing screamed stability like synchronized boots. Bureaucracy was tightened, the military was sharpened, and the message was clear. This was no longer the chaotic republic of committees. This was Napoleon's workshop, and everyone inside was either a tool, a nail, or about to get hammered into place. With the machinery of state neatly rearranged, Napoleon shifted gears to the true game, consolidating personal power. Officially, France still had multiple consuls, but in practice the others looked more like decorative potted plants next to his towering presence. He mastered the art of ruling by making everyone else feel indispensable while ensuring they were utterly disposable. Loyalists were rewarded with shiny titles, skeptics were shuffled into irrelevant posts, and loud opponents discovered sudden career changes involving exile or early retirement, sometimes permanent. Napoleon also turned propaganda into an art form. commissioning paintings where he appeared like a Roman god on horseback, crossing mountains as if gravity itself had signed a surrender treaty. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, he pulled strings, rewrote laws, and ensured that every lever of power somehow led back to his hand. The joke of the age was that France had traded 5 squabbling directors for one small man with 5 times their ambition. The difference? Napoleon didn't squabble. He simply devoured authority whole, leaving no crumbs for anyone else. By now, Napoleon had perfected the political two-step, one foot stomping down with brute force, the other gliding smoothly like a ballroom dancer. He could dissolve assemblies with the glare of a schoolteacher catching kids cheating, and in the same breath charm the public with speeches dripping in patriotic honey. His ministers often complained that meetings felt like theater, half intimidation, half seduction. One moment he'd slam the table and remind everyone that bayonets are persuasive. The next he'd flatter them with lines about destiny, greatness, and France being the envy of the world. The genius of his style was balance. Too much coercion and he risked rebellion, too much charm, and people might forget he had cannons. Instead, he wielded both like a conductor, with a baton in one hand and a sword in the other. To the masses, Napoleon appeared as the perfect mix of father figure and iron fist. To his rivals, he was a nightmare. Someone who could bully you into obedience while making you believe it was your patriotic duty to thank him afterward. On the streets of France, Napoleon was no longer just a general in uniform. He had been rebranded as the nation's savior, a walking miracle wrapped in a bicorn hat. Bread prices were still miserable, taxes still annoying, and politics still as chaotic as a tavern brawl, but somehow the public believed this small Corsican could fix it all. Mothers pointed at him to hush their children, workers toasted his name in dingy taverns, and poets wrote verses comparing him to Caesar, Alexander, and the occasional angel with better boots. The irony was delicious. The same people who once cheered for revolutions now cheered for the man putting a neat lid on them. His cult of personality grew like a fire, fed by both propaganda and genuine relief. He was the stern father, the heroic general, the charming statesman, all in one compact package. And in a France exhausted by instability, that was exactly the brand of miracle they were desperate to buy. Napoleon didn't just promise hope, he sold it wholesale, and the crowd lined up like eager customers at a divine marketplace. By the end of this whirlwind chapter, Napoleon had completed his transformation. No longer the dashing general adored for battlefield victories, but the polished leader who now ruled France with a pen as sharp as any sword. The coup had worked like a stage play, chaotic, comedic, and terrifying all at once. And the curtain closed with Napoleon standing at the center, the audience applauding because they had no other act left to cheer. France, exhausted from years of revolution, civil war, and a parade of failed governments, welcomed him as the man who could finally stop the merry-go-round of chaos. Of course, behind the curtain, he was still the same ambitious soldier, sharpening his plans for even greater power. But on the surface, he wore the costume of a statesman, speeches polished, decrees issued, and authority wrapped neatly in legitimacy. The irony? The revolution, once roaring about liberty and equality, now handed its hopes to a man who would soon crown himself emperor. In short, Napoleon had not only survived the storm, he had stolen the lightning, bottled it, and started selling tickets for the next show. France, once a nation spinning like a drunken top after years of revolution, suddenly found itself walking in a straight line, thanks to Napoleon. He tightened the purse strings, reorganized the bureaucracy, and convinced the army that marching under him was more profitable than rebelling against him. The streets of Paris, once echoing with mobs and guillotines, now hummed with the sounds of markets and soldiers drilling in neat formations. People who had survived the chaos looked around and thought, well, at least we're not starving or being randomly beheaded anymore. Of course, the joke was that they traded one circus for another. Instead of 5 clowns running the government, there was now just one very ambitious ringmaster. But stability has its price, and most citizens gladly paid it. Napoleon knew exactly how to package himself, the savior who restored order without making it look like tyranny. Yet, Behind the polished facade of reforms and laws, he was already sketching his next role. Today, first consul. Tomorrow, something bigger. France was calm, but calm like a pond hiding the shadow of a crocodile just beneath the surface. After stabilizing France, Napoleon decided it was time to try something radical: peace. Entered the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, a diplomatic truce with Britain that was less about love and more about catching their breath. The French public celebrated as if war had ended forever, while in London people raised eyebrows and muttered, "Temporary, very temporary." For Napoleon, the treaty was a clever pause button. He knew Europe was like a tavern brawl, everyone throwing chairs until someone gets tired. So he smiled, shook hands with Britain, and used the breathing space to reorganize France, fatten the treasury, and polish his image as a peacemaker. The comedy was that both sides acted like old enemies suddenly turned best friends, when in reality they were sharpening knives under the table. Britain eyed Napoleon's ambitions suspiciously. Napoleon eyed Britain's navy with equal resentment, and both pretended to sip wine in the same room. The Peace of Amiens was less a wedding than a forced blind date where both partners planned to ghost each other. For the moment, France could relax, but everyone knew the curtain of war would rise again soon, because this was Europe, not a fairy tale ending. While Europe was busy side-eyeing Napoleon's ambitions, he decided to leave behind something that would outlast cannons and bayonets: laws. In 1804, he unveiled the Napoleonic Code, a grand legal buffet promising clarity and equality. Well, at least for men. It declared all citizens equal before the law, abolished feudal leftovers, and gave France a modern legal skeleton. Of course, like any fine print, the comedy lay in the details. Women were politely informed they were now officially second-class citizens, and paternal authority was practically carved into stone. Yet compared to the chaos of arbitrary royal decrees, this was revolutionary. Napoleon strutted like a legal architect, presenting himself as a statesman rather than just a general with a big ego and a small hat. Europe watched in both awe and suspicion, because once France had a legal order, it could export it with the same enthusiasm it exported soldiers. The irony? Napoleon, who thrived on chaos and conquest, became the man who wrote rules everyone else eventually copied. The code was less a love letter to justice and more Napoleon's way of saying, even if I lose the battlefield, you'll still be living under my paperwork. After rewriting the laws, Napoleon turned his attention to shaping minds and managing paperwork, because conquest is easier when children are already trained to salute the chalkboard. He reorganized France's education system, building lycées that were less about creativity and more about drilling loyalty, discipline, and a suspicious amount of math. Students learned not just how to read and count, but how to admire maps with France conveniently in the center. At the same time, Napoleon tightened up the administration. Prefects were dispatched to provinces like loyal postmen with authority, ensuring Paris could micromanage every village. The result was a machine where bureaucracy hummed as efficiently as cannons fired. Of course, this meritocracy had a catch. Talent was welcome, but only if it bent the knee to Napoleon. It was both brilliant and terrifying. A generation of citizens taught to calculate, obey, and eventually cheer while he crowned himself emperor. The comedy lies in how thoroughly he turned schools and offices into recruitment centers for his empire, where rulers of the future were basically molded like tin soldiers in classrooms. France was no longer a chaotic republic. It was a neatly filed empire in waiting, with Napoleon as the headmaster and chief clerk rolled into one. If Napoleon had rewritten laws and rebuilt schools, now he decided to tackle something even more delicate: people's thoughts. The press, once buzzing with revolutionary chaos, was suddenly silenced like a tavern at closing time. Napoleon imposed strict censorship, turning newspapers into obedient parrots that squawked only what he approved. Instead of fiery debates and scandalous headlines, the people were served bland reports praising stability, order, and surprise, Napoleon. Satirical pamphlets vanished, replaced by bulletins that read more like love letters to the regime. Public opinion became less spontaneous and more choreographed, as if the entire nation was enrolled in a stage play where every line had been pre-written by Napoleon's scriptwriters. It was darkly comical. The man who claimed to bring freedom was busy gagging anyone with a pen sharper than his sword. Still, many citizens didn't mind. After years of terror and chaos, peace and predictability, even in the form of state-approved bedtime stories, felt like a luxury. The genius of Napoleon's system was not just silencing dissent, but convincing people that silence was exactly what they wanted to hear. In short, he became the editor-in-chief of France, with headlines that always seemed suspiciously flattering. After silencing the press and rewriting the rules, Napoleon finally grabbed the crown jewel of ambition, absolute political power. What had started as a republic with noble ideals now looked suspiciously like a company taken over by a ruthless CEO, except this one wore epaulets instead of a tie. The so-called elections were less about choice and more about theater, with ballots that read like, "Do you love Napoleon? Yes or yes." Political opponents vanished faster than unpaid interns. He surrounded himself with ministers who nodded so often they looked like bobblehead dolls. And the Senate, once proud of its authority, turned into a polite clapping machine. The irony dripped. The man who rose to power promising to protect the Republic had now locked it in a golden cage and called it progress. Yet the people, weary of chaos, applauded as if they were at the premiere of a well-rehearsed play. By consolidating power into his hands, Napoleon became less a leader and more a one-man government. France had a new job title for him. Not consul, not president, but the grand puppeteer pulling every string, while smiling like it was all for the greater good. By 1804, Napoleon had grown tired of titles like consul or first citizen, too modest for a man who already controlled everything. So in a move that made every king in Europe choke on their wine, he crowned himself emperor at Notre Dame Cathedral. Yes, you heard that right. Not waiting for the Pope's blessing, Napoleon snatched the crown and placed it on his own head, as if saying, "Thanks, but I'll handle the divine part myself." The Pope, relegated to background actor, looked like someone invited to a wedding only to realize he was there to clap politely. The ceremony dripped with irony. The revolution that once guillotined monarchs now applauded a new one, manufactured, repackaged, and wearing French epaulets. Napoleon's family cheered, courtiers bowed, and the public watched with a mix of awe and confusion, wondering if they should shout, "Vive la République," or "Long live the Emperor." It was the ultimate rebranding stunt. The Republic died not with a bang, but with a glittering coronation, where the man who promised equality declared himself the boss of bosses, sealing France's transition from boardroom politics to imperial theater. Once Napoleon crowned himself emperor, he realized a crown alone doesn't make a kingdom sparkle. So he built a brand new court straight out of a royal makeover show. Gone were the days of Republican simplicity, in marched velvet drapes, golden furniture, and officials dressed like they had raided Versailles' clearance sale. Ministers who once prided themselves on being citizens of the Republic now strutted about in embroidered coats, wigs, and medals, looking like extras from an overfunded opera. Even Josephine, once the fashionable socialite, was promoted to full-time empress with gowns designed to scream, "Move over, Marie Antoinette." The irony was delicious. The revolution had fought to rid France of aristocratic pomp, only for Napoleon to recreate it bigger, shinier, and with better choreography. Courtiers lined up to bow, flatter, and compete for positions, turning politics into a royal reality show where survival meant applause, not ideology. It was as if France had unsubscribed from the Republic and upgraded to the imperial premium package, complete with glitter, protocols, and the occasional scandal. Napoleon didn't just rule, he staged a spectacle, proving power is best served with gold trim and applause. By now, Napoleon was no longer just a man in uniform. He had mutated into a full-blown icon, the human equivalent of a corporate logo. His profile appeared everywhere, on coins, in paintings, on statues so large they looked like France was trying to compensate for something. Citizens who once chanted for liberty now bought souvenirs with his face, as if tyranny was suddenly collectible merchandise. In Paris, gossip spread that Napoleon didn't walk anymore. He merely glided on a cloud of pure authority. His generals bowed so low it looked like they were hunting for loose change on the floor, and even foreign monarchs began treating him less like a fellow ruler and more like an inevitable weather system. Ironically, the Republic's ideals of equality had shrunk to one simple equation: Napoleon, Sherman, France. If the revolution had promised that power belonged to the people, Napoleon had upgraded it to a deluxe single-user license, valid for life. And the people, dazzled by victories and parades, accepted the deal with applause. He wasn't just leading a nation, he was branding it, and the brand was Napoleon, absolute power now available in gold trim. France had officially gone from shouting about liberty, equality, and fraternity to quietly accepting a monarchy 2.0, complete with gold-plated upgrades. The Republic, once the rebellious teenager of Europe, had now shown up at the party wearing its father's crown. Newspapers praised the return of stability, which was just a polite way of saying, "Congratulations, we're back to bowing again." The politicians who once yelled against tyranny were now perfecting their kneeling techniques, and the people, dazzled by parades and victories, treated the coronation like the season finale of their favorite drama. The irony was rich. After guillotining kings for excess, the French were now cheering for an emperor who staged excess with better lighting. Napoleon had managed what seemed impossible, turning revolution into a brand new empire without anyone noticing the receipt. France wasn't a republic in disguise anymore. It was an empire with fireworks, and Napoleon was the CEO, chairman, and mascot all rolled into one. Curtain down. The revolution was dead. Long live the empire. On a freezing December morning in 1805, Napoleon pulled off what history now calls the Battle of Austerlitz, but his PR team could have sold tickets as the Clash of the Three Emperors. Facing the combined might of Russia and Austria, Napoleon pretended to be weak, luring his enemies into a trap like a fox playing dead in front of two clueless hunters. As the sun broke through the mist, later dubbed the Sun of Austerlitz, the French army unleashed a masterstroke, splitting enemy lines while their commanders argued about lunch. By the end of the day, the coalition was in tatters. Russian troops drowning in icy lakes, Austrian pride frozen stiff, and Napoleon strutting like a man who just checkmated Europe in one move. Black comedy writes itself here. Two emperors watched their armies collapse, while the third, shorter one, used their downfall as a catwalk moment. This wasn't just a battle, it was Napoleon's grand announcement. "Gentlemen, I am not just playing the game, I'm rewriting the rules." Austerlitz became the crown jewel of his military genius, and the rest of Europe would never look at him, or their borders, the same way again. After Austerlitz, Napoleon wasn't just basking in the glow of victory, he was rubbing Austria and Russia's noses in it. The mighty coalition that was supposed to crush him had instead become the punchline of Europe's biggest joke. Austria, once the proud elder of European politics, now looked like a beaten schoolboy, forced to sign humiliating treaties while clutching its broken crown. Russia, meanwhile, limped back east, licking its wounds and pretending the whole disaster had been a strategic retreat. Napoleon, with the swagger of a man who had just flipped the chessboard and still declared checkmate, turned this victory into a diplomatic banquet. He paraded treaties like trophies, carved up influence across Europe, and left his enemies looking like they'd paid to attend their own humiliation. Black comedy thrives here. Two empires that once believed they were eternal powers ended up as background extras in Napoleon's highlight reel. With every signature on those treaties, Europe tilted further in his favor. The irony? The very monarchs who had sought to defend the old order were now the ones crowning the new emperor with their own surrender. After humiliating Austria and Russia, Napoleon turned his gaze toward Prussia, a kingdom that fancied itself Europe's stern schoolmaster. The Prussians, full of pride and outdated drills, marched into battle as if Frederick the Great's ghost was still coaching them. Unfortunately, Napoleon wasn't a student who played by the rules. At Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, he tore apart Prussia's Grand Army with the precision of a tailor slicing through cheap fabric. The so-called disciplined lines of Prussian soldiers melted away under the French columns and cavalry like butter under a hot knife. Black comedy writes itself. An army that had spent decades polishing buttons and perfecting goose steps was trampled by an enemy that fought like it was improvising a symphony of chaos. Within days, the proud capital, Berlin, fell, and Prussia's officers, who once strutted around like peacocks, suddenly looked like plucked chickens. Napoleon didn't just win battles. He rewrote the script of European warfare. And as the Prussian monarchy begged for mercy, the man from Corsica smirked, proving yet again that he was not just toppling armies, but also crushing the egos of entire nations. After crushing Prussia, Napoleon no longer played the role of just a conqueror. He transformed into the master of contracts, the real estate agent of Europe. The so-called kings and emperors, once roaring lions, now queued up like nervous tenants, signing lease agreements with their new landlord. Treaties were drafted, signed, and stamped at a speed that made notaries dizzy. At Tilsit and other grand tables, monarchs sat across from Napoleon, their crowns trembling as they nodded to every clause. It was less diplomacy and more like stand-up comedy with ink pens. Napoleon dictated terms, and the defeated rulers pretended they had a choice. Black comedy flourished as emperors who once puffed their chests on battlefields now bowed over parchment, trading dignity for survival. Every signature was a reminder that the Corsican outsider had turned Europe's aristocracy into unwilling extras in his one-man show. The irony? These treaties, meant to guarantee stability, only cemented Napoleon's legend as the emperor who conquered not only with cannons, but also with contracts, rewriting Europe's political script as if it were just another punchline in his grand performance. Having forced treaties into the trembling hands of Europe's monarchs, Napoleon now upgraded his act. Cartographer-in-chief of the continent, with maps sprawled across grand tables, he didn't just move borders, he carved them up like a chef slicing a cake, generously handing out slices to suit his appetite. Kingdoms were redrawn, duchies repackaged, and whole nations shuffled around like furniture in a chaotic living room. Black comedy played out as centuries-old borders, once defended with blood, were erased with the flick of his quill. Imagine noble envoys staring in disbelief as their homelands became bargaining chips, traded like poker cards in Napoleon's personal casino. France grew fat, allies were rewarded, and enemies reduced to awkward, shrunken silhouettes on the map. The great irony? While he claimed to bring order, his lines on the parchment only guaranteed future chaos. Each stroke of ink was a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode in rebellion, revenge, or the next coalition. Yet in that moment, Napoleon strutted as if he were not just emperor of men, but of geography itself, rewriting Europe with the swagger of a man convinced that maps were just drafts for his personal amusement. After redrawing Europe like a bored student doodling on a map, Napoleon decided to upgrade the game, handing out thrones as if they were party favors. His brothers, once ordinary, Bonaparte, suddenly became kings, dukes, and princes. Joseph was shoved onto Spain's throne, Jerome got Westphalia, and Louis received Holland, whether the locals wanted them or not. It was nepotism at its most theatrical, a family reunion that accidentally turned into a coronation binge. Generals who had once fetched him coffee were now given crowns, stumbling into royal court still smelling faintly of gunpowder. The black comedy was glaring. Nations, centuries old, reduced to props in Napoleon's grand puppet show. Their rulers swapped out like actors mid-play. Citizens blinked in disbelief as strange men with French accents declared themselves monarchs overnight. Napoleon strutted proudly, convinced he was building a dynasty for the ages. In truth, he was planting landmines of resentment, guaranteeing future revolts. But in the glittering halls where he staged these royal promotions, the illusion held, Europe looked less like a continent and more like a Bonaparte family business, complete with crowns, scepters, and a company motto, all in the family. By now, Napoleon's shadow stretched across every court in Europe, and monarchs quivered like school children waiting outside the headmaster's office. Kings who once strutted with crowns now whispered nervously, unsure whether to bow, fight, or send him a fruit basket. Diplomats scrambled to keep up, writing treaties at lightning speed, only to watch Napoleon tear them up as if they were grocery lists. In Vienna, Berlin, and Madrid, chandeliers trembled not from earthquakes, but from gossip about what Napoleon might demand next. Courts that had long thrived on pomp and pageantry suddenly looked like backstage dressing rooms after a comedy play. Powdered wigs askew, jewels clattering, and nobles clutching wine glasses with shaky hands. The irony was delicious. These were dynasties centuries old. But one Corsican artillery officer had reduced them to a chorus of nervous actors, praying not to be written out of his script. In salons, noble ladies fanned themselves furiously, debating whether Napoleon was a military genius or Europe's most flamboyant stage director. Whatever the verdict, the courts danced to his tune, a macabre waltz led by the man who treated crowns like costume jewelry. While European courts trembled, Napoleon's army moved like a perfectly choreographed dance troupe, except their ballet ended with cannons. His genius wasn't just in winning battles, but in rewriting the rulebook. Instead of rigid lines of musket fire, he unleashed flexible corps, each able to fight like a mini-army. Soldiers marched faster than gossip at a royal wedding, outflanking enemies before they even finished breakfast. His discipline was brutal, yet effective. A loaf of bread had to stretch for 10 men, but woe to the soldier who strayed, for Napoleon's wrath was swifter than enemy sabers. Drills were so relentless that men could reload muskets half asleep, which was convenient, since many were half asleep. Black comedy lurked in every maneuver, an empire built on speed, hunger, and the occasional miracle of marching boots not falling apart. To generals raised on slow wars of etiquette, Napoleon's methods looked like sorcery. To his enemies, it was a nightmare of endless marching shadows. And yet beneath the brilliance, there was a strange irony. The emperor who demanded precision from thousands of men often improvised his own grand strategies like a gambler playing dice with Europe. By now, Napoleon was not just a general or even a ruler. He was the gravitational force of Europe, pulling kings, ministers, and terrified diplomats into his orbit, whether they liked it or not. He stood at the absolute peak of power, crowning himself emperor as if to say, "Why let the Pope have the spotlight?" His army sprawled from Madrid to Warsaw, a marching machine that devoured maps faster than diplomats could redraw them. Yet the comedy of it all was delicious. This master of discipline and order ruled an empire built on chaos, bankrupt treasuries, and soldiers who hadn't seen a decent loaf of bread in weeks. Royal families tried to keep up appearances, waltzing at balls while secretly measuring the size of French boots outside their palaces. For common folk, Napoleon was both savior and tax collector-in-chief. He brought laws and roads, but also conscription slips that snatched away sons. In the smoky glow of victory, Europe looked less like a continent of nations and more like Napoleon's personal chessboard. At the summit of glory, he strutted like a titan, unaware that even titans can stumble, especially when their empire runs on hunger, improvisation, and one man's relentless ego. Europe, once a patchwork of proud kingdoms and ancient dynasties, now looked like a theater where Napoleon played every role: director, actor, and critic. Under his shadow, emperors became extras, kings turned into props, and borders were redrawn like doodles in his imperial notebook. The comedy was that everyone pretended this was stability. Balls were held, treaties signed, and portraits painted, all while Europe shuffled nervously to the beat of French drums. From Madrid to Warsaw, his name was whispered with awe and resentment, like a tax collector who also happened to be a god. Roads bore his codes, armies carried his discipline, and thrones bore his brothers. Yet beneath the grandeur, the cracks were already there. Stretched supply lines, restless populations, and enemies who only pretended to be defeated. But for the moment, this glorious, ironic moment, Napoleon stood as the master of Europe, his silhouette towering across the continent. It was less an empire than a one-man show with a cast of millions, all unwilling participants in the spectacle. And as the curtain fell on this act, the audience cheered and trembled at once, unaware that Act Two would be far less triumphant. Fresh from towering over Europe, Napoleon marched into the Iberian Peninsula expecting another swift masterpiece, the kind he could later brag about in bulletins. Instead, he discovered that Spain and Portugal were less of a battlefield and more of a quicksand pit wearing a crown. The locals didn't play by his rules. No neat lines, no decisive battles, just endless ambushes, priests blessing rifles, and peasants who treated French supply wagons like piñatas. What was supposed to be a victory parade turned into a carnival of chaos, with British support under Wellington adding an unwelcome twist to the plot. Napoleon's marshals, usually so brilliant on grand stages, now looked like actors stuck in a slapstick skit, slipping on the banana peels of guerrilla warfare. Every village burned, every road ambushed, every alley ready to switch sides at the scent of French weakness. Europe watched with morbid amusement. The great conqueror, who once bent emperors to his will, was now trapped in a dusty corner, battling shadows and stubborn farmers. The Peninsular War wasn't just a military headache. It was Napoleon's first taste of the slow bleed, a wound that wouldn't kill him outright, but made sure he'd never walk the same way again. If Napoleon thought the Peninsular War was just a passing headache, Spain made sure to upgrade it into a full-blown migraine. The guerrilla fighters weren't an army in the traditional sense. They were more like mosquitoes with muskets, buzzing out of nowhere, biting hard, then disappearing back into the night. French columns marched proudly through villages only to find their supplies looted, their officers kidnapped, and their morale trampled by peasants who refused to play fair. Priests turned pulpits into command centers, farmers turned scythes into weapons, and even grandmothers seemed ready to stab a French soldier with knitting needles. For once, Napoleon's marshals couldn't rely on their beloved strategies. There was no battlefield to dominate, only an endless series of ambushes, sabotage, and fires erupting like spontaneous fireworks. Britain, of course, gleefully fueled the chaos, slipping money and muskets into Spanish hands as if sponsoring the world's most violent street theater. The so-called invincible French army found itself bleeding away in tiny cuts, humiliated not by emperors or kings, but by stubborn villagers who fought with the enthusiasm of people defending their last loaf of bread. This was no longer a campaign. It was a slow-motion humiliation reel that Europe watched with wicked delight. After Spain turned into an endless quagmire, Napoleon needed a grand stage to remind Europe who still ran the show. Enter the Battle of Wagram, a clash so massive it looked like two nations had emptied their entire population onto a single field just to yell at each other with cannons. Napoleon technically won, but it was the kind of victory that comes with a hangover the size of Austria. His troops staggered through smoke and blood, as if marching inside a giant butcher's shop, while the Austrians refused to die politely. Artillery thundered day and night, generals barked orders no one could hear, and whole regiments vanished like bad investments. By the end, the French held the field, yet the cost was absurd. Tens of thousands dead or maimed. And even Napoleon looked less like a conquering god and more like a man wondering if his empire came with a money-back guarantee. The battle was hailed as a triumph, but in reality, it was a warning siren. The invincible French war machine could still win, yes, but at a price so steep it was practically a mortgage on disaster. After Wagram's bloody victory, Napoleon faced a different kind of battlefield, his own marriage. Josephine, the woman who had been with him through triumph and humiliation, was suddenly cast aside like an outdated fashion. Why? Because she couldn't give him an heir. In true imperial logic, Napoleon decided that love was expendable, but dynastic insurance was mandatory. So he divorced Josephine with the cold efficiency of filing paperwork and married Marie-Louise, the Austrian princess, as if signing a new treaty with a better warranty. The French court gossiped, the Austrians sighed in relief, and Josephine wept while still wearing the crown jewels. The irony? By trading his fiery, loyal partner for a teenage duchess, Napoleon gained an heir but lost half his soul. It was less a love story than a corporate merger, two empires shaking hands over a marriage contract. From the outside, it looked like a masterstroke, France and Austria united by blood. But inside the palace walls, it smelled suspiciously like desperation dressed in silk. Napoleon, the conqueror of Europe, had finally been conquered by the dull arithmetic of succession. With Josephine gone and a shiny new Habsburg bride on his arm, Napoleon turned his gaze eastward, toward the giant bear of Europe, Russia. The man who once declared that geography was destiny now believed he could redraw the map with bayonets and bravado. The plan? Assemble the largest army Europe had ever seen, more than 500,000 men marching under the French eagle. It was less a campaign and more like organizing the world's deadliest road trip. Supplies? questionable, allies, reluctant, confidence, overflowing. As his generals whispered about logistics in winter, Napoleon waved them off with the confidence of a gambler doubling down after losing 3 hands in a row. To him, Moscow wasn't just a city, it was a trophy waiting on the mantelpiece of history. The irony was that while he thought he was preparing for ultimate glory, Europe saw a man slowly tightening the noose around his own neck. The roads of Poland and Lithuania would soon bear witness to the most ambitious and disastrous march in modern memory. But in 1811, in the candlelit war councils of Paris, it still looked like destiny waiting to be claimed. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon launched what he believed would be the crowning achievement of his career, the invasion of Russia. With over 500,000 soldiers at his command, he strutted at the head of the Grande Armée like a man hosting the world's deadliest parade. Spirits were high, drums thundered, banners gleamed, and everyone believed they were marching straight into immortality. Napoleon painted the campaign as a short stroll to Moscow, with victory waiting just beyond the horizon. Reality, of course, had other plans. The Russians didn't fight fair. They retreated, burned their own villages, and left nothing behind but ashes and empty fields. The further the army marched, the less it resembled an invincible war machine, and more a caravan of hungry, footsore men chasing a mirage. Napoleon, ever the gambler, brushed aside the warnings. He had beaten Austria, Prussia, and half of Europe. Surely Russia would fold like a bad hand of cards. What began as a display of unstoppable power quickly started to feel like a grand joke, with the punchline waiting somewhere in the endless Russian plains. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he expected a grand prize, the jewel of Russia, ready to bow to his empire. Instead, he found a silent city that looked more like the set of a horror play. Streets were empty, doors swung open like stage props, and food was scarcer than humility in Napoleon's court. Just as the French were settling in, the real performance began. Flames erupted across the city, turning Moscow into a fiery inferno. The Russians had abandoned their capital and set it ablaze, denying Napoleon his glorious stage. He could only stand there, watching the city burn, like a host who had invited himself to a banquet only to find the table flipped and the wine on fire. For once, the Grande Armée had no one to fight, no victory to claim, just smoke in their lungs and ash in their rations. Napoleon, the master of Europe, was reduced to a squatter in a ruined city, waiting for a surrender that never came. The great conqueror had walked into Moscow expecting applause, but the curtain rose on nothing but fire and silence, the cruelest encore of his career. If Moscow's flames were cruel, then the Russian winter was downright sadistic. Napoleon's Grande Armée, once the terror of Europe, now shuffled through snowdrifts like an army of frozen scarecrows. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, gnawed on horseflesh, and cursed the cold with the creativity of poets. Frostbite became the new enemy general, amputating fingers and toes with ruthless efficiency. Horses collapsed, cannons were abandoned, and the proud columns of men dwindled into ragged processions. Napoleon, wrapped in his cloak, tried to look like the unshakable emperor, but even he couldn't command the snow to stop falling. His grand campaign, which began with pomp and thunder, was now reduced to a tragic comedy, a parade of icicles and uniforms stumbling westward. Every mile was a funeral, every camp a hospital without medicine. The master strategist who once rearranged the map of Europe was now at the mercy of weather, as if nature itself had decided to teach him humility. By the time the survivors limped back, the Grande Armée was no longer grand. It was a ghost army, frozen in memory as the empire's cruel turning point. As the Grande Armée limped home in tatters, Europe looked at Napoleon not with fear, but with opportunity. The once unstoppable conqueror was suddenly the guy who slipped on the world's iciest banana peel, and every neighbor wanted in on the humiliation. Old enemies and former allies alike dusted off their uniforms and gathered around the table, clinking glasses to the idea of a new coalition. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, states that had been bullied, beaten, or bribed by Napoleon, now found common cause, kicking him while he was down. It was less a strategic alliance and more a neighborhood watch group against a particularly arrogant tenant. Propaganda painted Napoleon as a monster, a tyrant, even the Antichrist, while European courts congratulated themselves on saving civilization, conveniently forgetting their own ambitions. What Napoleon had dismissed as petty rivals now banded together as a hydra with too many heads for him to cut off. His aura of invincibility had melted away with the Russian snow, leaving Europe eager for revenge. The master of divide and conquer now found himself divided against and conquered, a tragicomic reversal of fortune that was as satisfying to his enemies as it was devastating to his empire. From the heights of empire to the depths of despair, Napoleon's downfall played out faster than a tragicomedy on stage. Just a few years earlier, he was the crowned master of Europe, handing out kingdoms like party favors. Now he resembled an actor whose script had been torn up mid-performance, left stammering while the audience booed. The Russian disaster gutted his army, the new coalition pressed hard from all sides, and even his allies began to look at him the way creditors look at a bankrupt gambler. What once was awe had curdled into mockery. Cartoonists across Europe drew him shorter by the day, as if his stature shrank with every retreat. The man who had reshaped Europe now faced the same fate as his victims: humiliation, isolation, and the looming promise of exile. It was a brutal reminder that power is a loan, not a gift, and history always comes back for repayment with interest. Napoleon's meteoric rise had dazzled the world, but his fall proved just as spectacular, a cautionary tale about ambition burning too brightly and then freezing to death in the Russian snow. After the Russian catastrophe, Napoleon's enemies smelled blood and wasted no time. The result was the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, nicknamed the Battle of Nations, because practically all of Europe showed up to punch France in the face. Imagine a rock concert where every band hates the headliner. That was Leipzig. Napoleon, once the master of dazzling maneuvers, suddenly looked like a chess player who had run out of pieces, desperately moving pawns against an army of queens. His troops, battered and demoralized, collapsed under the sheer weight of coalition forces from Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden. Cannons roared, horses fell, and bridges exploded, sometimes with Napoleon's own soldiers still on them, thanks to panic and poor timing. For the first time, the man who had rewritten the rules of European warfare couldn't bluff his way out. His aura of invincibility cracked, and Europe cheered as the giant stumbled. Leipzig wasn't just a defeat, it was the announcement that the Napoleon show was officially past its prime, and the encore would be much shorter than anyone expected. After the humiliation at Leipzig, Napoleon's crown slipped faster than a wig in a storm. By 1814, the Allies were at the gates of Paris, and even his marshals, once loyal like overpaid bodyguards, were quietly packing their resumes. Faced with defeat and betrayal, Napoleon did something unthinkable. He resigned. The man who had crowned himself emperor now had to uncrown himself, a DIY project no one expected. The Allies spared him execution. Europe didn't want a martyr, just an exiled nuisance. So they shipped him off to the island of Elba, a Mediterranean speck better suited for vacationers than world conquerors. There, Napoleon was given a small army, a modest court, and an island playground barely big enough for his ego. To go from ruling half of Europe to managing island traffic regulations was a cosmic joke of the highest order. Yet as he boarded the ship to Elba, you could almost hear him thinking, "This isn't over." The emperor without an empire was down, but he was already plotting how to turn a forced retirement into the world's most dramatic comeback tour. Elba was supposed to be Napoleon's retirement island, but he treated it like a rehearsal stage for Act Two. By 1815, Europe's new rulers were busy congratulating themselves, sipping wine, and pretending the world was finally safe. Meanwhile, Napoleon slipped away from Elba with 1,000 men, a handful of cannons, and more self-confidence than a rock star on a reunion tour. When he landed in France, the royal troops sent to arrest him didn't fire. Instead, they switched sides with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for free beer. In a matter of weeks, the exiled emperor marched triumphantly into Paris, as if he had merely taken a long vacation. The whole escapade, later called the 100 Days, was less a comeback and more a historical prank on Europe. Kings and diplomats had underestimated his ability to turn charisma into political currency. His return wasn't just dramatic, It was absurd, like the final twist in a soap opera no one thought had another season. For Napoleon, the throne was once again within reach, but Europe was already sharpening its knives for the finale. If Napoleon's return during the Hundred Days was a theatrical encore, then Waterloo was the disastrous final act, where the stage collapsed on the performer. In June 1815, Napoleon faced off against the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army led by Blücher. He promised his men glory, but what they got was mud, rain, and an emperor who seemed to have misplaced his legendary luck. The French cavalry charged like they were auditioning for a heroic painting, only to be shredded by British squares that refused to break. Meanwhile, Wellington held the line with the patience of a man waiting for reinforcements, and right on cue, Blücher's army thundered onto the field like an uninvited party guest. By evening, Napoleon's dream of reclaiming Europe dissolved into chaos. Cannons roared, soldiers fled, and the man once hailed as invincible was left staring at ruin. Waterloo wasn't just a defeat, it was a historical punchline, the moment when the unstoppable conqueror was finally stopped. By mud, timing, and a coalition determined to end his legend once and for all. After Waterloo, Europe decided Napoleon deserved a vacation. Except instead of beaches and cocktails, his destination was St. Helena, a rocky speck in the middle of the Atlantic. It was the geopolitical equivalent of being locked in the broom closet of history. Once the terror of kings, the man who redrew maps now found himself arguing with British officers about furniture arrangements and complaining about the food. His entourage, a handful of loyalists, tried to maintain dignity, but the emperor's empire had shrunk to a garden, a few chickens, and endless windswept cliffs. The British, terrified he might escape again, like from Elba, stationed guards as if he were about to stage another comeback, though now his battlefield was damp weather and boredom. Napoleon, once master of Europe, became the world's most famous island prisoner, pacing the same few acres while plotting speeches no one would hear. St. Helena wasn't just exile, it was history's cruel joke. The man who once controlled millions, reduced to watching waves crash, his legend trapped on a rock at the edge of nowhere. On St. Helena, Napoleon's empire of boredom truly began. Once a man who commanded armies across continents, he now commanded only a leaky roof, a squeaky chair, and a few disgruntled servants who wondered if following him had been such a good idea. His health declined, his waistline expanded, and his temper flared at the smallest of inconveniences, like bad wine or overcooked chicken. The island was a prison without bars, where his only battles were against damp sheets and creeping loneliness. Some days he would pace the garden as if maneuvering invisible troops. Other days he sulked in bed, dictating grievances against the British like a general waging war with ink. His isolation turned the once thunderous conqueror into a grumpy landlord of nothing, raging at the ocean as if it were an enemy army. For a man who once made emperors tremble, being ignored by the world was the cruelest punishment. St. Helena transformed Napoleon into a tragicomic figure, the great strategist stuck in an eternal stalemate with boredom itself. With nothing left but time and a crumbling empire of damp walls, Napoleon discovered a new battlefield: paper. On St. Helena, he dictated his memoirs with the urgency of a man trying to rewrite history before history wrote him out entirely. Surrounded by secretaries scribbling furiously, he painted himself as the misunderstood genius, the tragic hero, the victim of British villainy. Every lost battle became a brilliant maneuver, sabotaged by incompetent marshals. Every retreat transformed into a noble gesture of strategy. It was less autobiography, more theatrical performance. Napoleon's final campaign, fought with ink instead of cannon fire. His quill marched across the page like a drumbeat of self-justification, each sentence a bayonet pointed at posterity. Even as his health withered, his words thundered louder, carefully crafted to ensure that when people remembered him, they would recall Caesar in a bicorn, not a grumpy exile yelling at damp ceilings. Ironically, his memoirs succeeded. Centuries later, many still see Napoleon not as a fallen tyrant, but as a tragic titan, proof that the pen really can outlast the sword. On May 5, 1821, the final curtain dropped on Napoleon's one-man show. The once feared emperor, who had rattled Europe with cannons and coronations, now lay in a damp bed on St. Helena, defeated not by generals, but by his own failing body. Witnesses claimed his last words were about France, the army, and Josephine. A sentimental encore from a man who usually preferred the drumbeat of victory marches. In truth, death arrived less like a noble exit and more like an overworked stagehand cutting the lights. The British, ever cautious, even examined his stomach to prove he wasn't poisoned, because apparently even in death, Napoleon needed an international conspiracy to keep the drama alive. His death mask was cast, his body wrapped, and suddenly the island that had been his cage became a mausoleum. Strangely enough, this quiet death only amplified the legend. Europe had finally rid itself of the troublesome general, yet his myth grew louder. In a delicious twist of irony, Napoleon the man was gone, but Napoleon the symbol marched on, larger than ever. Napoleon may have died on a damp island, but his ghost refused to retire quietly. His legal reforms, the Napoleonic Code, still haunt courtrooms worldwide, turning dusty lawyers into accidental disciples. His military strategies, once dismissed as reckless, became bedtime stories for every general who ever dreamed of a fast promotion. And politically, Napoleon left behind the awkward truth that one ambitious man can redraw maps faster than diplomats with a lifetime of ink. France itself remained split. Was he the genius savior who modernized the nation, or the egomaniac who dragged it into endless wars? The irony is that the man who crowned himself emperor ended up more influential dead than alive, a spectral consultant for both Democrats and dictators alike. Monarchs studied him to avoid his fate. Revolutionaries studied him to replicate his audacity. In short, Europe buried Napoleon's body, but his ideas kept storming back like an army on eternal campaign. Death gave him what he craved all along, immortality, not in flesh, but in the inconvenient persistence of his legacy. And so, Napoleon's story closes not with a drumroll of cannons, but with the peculiar encore of a man who refused to exit history's stage. He began as a Corsican outsider, rose to emperor of Europe, and ended up dictating laws to future generations from beyond the grave. His shadow looms across parliaments, battlefields, and lecture halls alike. Was he a tyrant dressed as a reformer, or a reformer disguised as a tyrant? The punchline is that he managed to be both, depending on who's grading the essay. The black comedy of Napoleon's life is that his defeats made him mortal, but his failures cemented his immortality. Waterloo buried his body, St. Helena buried his pride. Yet his legend never stopped marching. Even today, politicians name-drop him, generals imitate him, and storytellers like us cannot resist dragging him back into the spotlight. Perhaps that's his greatest victory, to outlive his century, his enemies, even his empire. Napoleon, an inconvenient ghost, forever strutting in boots that no one else dares to fill.